it autism or is it quirky? That's a question I get very often from parents and people that I do autism assessments for. Even by the time they get to the assessment, they're just not quite sure if they really have autism or perhaps they're just a little bit quirky. So today, let's look at the criteria for diagnosing autism. One way to simplify it is to think of it like a meal deal. So there are three main elements to a meal deal. We have a drink, some fries, and a burger. It's the same with autism. We're looking for three main differences. One is communication, the next one is socialization, and the last one is repetitive behaviors. If you only have one element, you only have a drink, then it's not a meal deal. If you only have fries, that's not a meal deal either. And if you only have a burger, that's not a meal deal. And it's the same with autism. If you only have repetitive behaviours, it's not autism. If you only have social differences, it's not autism. And if you only have communication differences, it's not autism. You need all three elements for a diagnosis of autism. Hi, I'm Liz Smalley. Welcome to the Thriving with Autism podcast. And today we're talking about the diagnostic criteria for autism. Quite often, parents in particular ask me if their child's just a little bit quirky or if they are actually autistic. And sometimes it's really hard to know. And there's nothing wrong with either of those. You can be quirky and autistic, or you can be quirky and not autistic, because there is a certain criteria that you have to meet for a diagnosis. The criteria is outlined in the international guidebook called the DSM-5. There's another one called the ICD-10. In Australia, we're using the DSM-5. So let's have a look at those criteria in a little bit more detail. So the first one, social differences. So the things that we're looking for that are in the criteria are: does the person have difficulty having a back and forth conversation? Can they keep a conversation going if it's not about their favourite thing? Now, we know that when you talk to somebody who has a special interest and they're so passionate about their subject, they can talk about that non-stop, and sometimes that's called an info dump. No problem talking about that. But is it a back and forth conversation? Is the other person interested in what you're talking about? Are they passionate about pandas and it's a mutual conversation? Or are they just a receptacle for you to dump all your info in? Are you just looking for an audience, or do you want a back and forth conversation? Now, that's not to be judgmental. It's just one of the things we're looking for. Most people will have a reciprocal or back and forth conversation. Sometimes for autistic people, that's actually really hard. The other thing is a reduced interest in sharing of your emotions, sharing the other person's interest, sharing your feelings, initiating a hug, or reaching out to initiate a conversation. Quite often that's really quite hard for autistic people. The other thing that we're looking for in this section of social differences is difficulty starting a conversation or starting a friendship, and also responding. So, for example, one of the questions on one of the assessments I use asks, if another child came up to play, would your child interact with them? Would they respond? Usually with typical kids, they're going to respond. This can be really hard for autistic people. When somebody comes up, they don't know them, they might be at the park, they don't know if they're a safe person or not. So quite often they might just ignore them. So that's one of the other differences. So difference number one, social differences. Okay, number two, non-verbal communication differences. So this might mean differences with eye contact. Now, I always feel like it sounds a little bit judgy to say, do you look people in the eye when they're talking to you? That makes it sound like it's wrong. I think a better question is, How do you feel when you look someone in the eye and you're talking to them? What a lot of people have told me is, I can either look at you or I can listen to you. I can't do both. It's too much information. The other pattern that I've noticed with girls perhaps is that girls will give eye contact, and boys, but they don't like it. They do it because they're complying, but they don't like it and it feels very uncomfortable. So, a better question, in my opinion, is, how do you feel about eye contact? Would you rather not do it? So, that's one difference. Another one is difficulty with gestures, not quite catching on to the gesture. So, an example of this might be blowing a kiss goodbye. Are they going to blow it back? Do they know what you're doing? Or the other one is waving goodbye. A lot of autistic people don't like waving goodbye. They also don't like saying goodbye. And I've had quite a few people tell me, I kind of do an Irish goodbye where they just melt away. So that's a difference. And another one is differences with facial expressions. Something that's quite common is giggling when you're in trouble. You know that you shouldn't be giggling, or giggling at a funeral. You know you shouldn't be doing it. It's not appropriate. But the more you think you shouldn't do it, the worse it gets, and the more irritable the people around you get. If you're correcting somebody and they're laughing in your face, it's really quite triggering and can make you feel a little bit angry. And then that starts off a whole chain reaction of things that are not going to go well. Okay, let me scroll down on my screen here. So another difficulty that autistic people have is switching your behaviour for the situation. So when you're in the park as a little kid, you can tear around like crazy, jump all over the place, climb all over everything, and it's fine. But when you go to McDonald's or you go to a restaurant with your grandparents or you go to church, you're kind of expected to sit down and like rein it in a bit. That can be really difficult for autistic people to change their behaviour to match the situation. The other difficulty people have sometimes is making friends. So having difficulty communicating also knocks on to having difficulty with socialising and making friends. So making friends can be quite difficult. It can mean things like maybe an unusual approach to a friend, like maybe playing in the sandpit, and the autistic child will just go up and blurt out about pandas. Sorry for picking on pandas today. Whereas other kids might sort of approach that a little bit more slowly. So that's one difference, and it can make it hard to make friends. The other thing that makes friendships quite hard, particularly if somebody has PDA, I'm sorry, I hate this term, pathological demand avoidance, they're going to want to be in control of the game all the time. They're going to tell you what to do, almost like a director. It's not really mutual. You're pieces to be moved around in their game and do what they want you to do. And they have a set idea in their mind how this is going to go. And then when it doesn't go that way and somebody goes off script, it's very distressing for an autistic person when somebody goes off script and then they just don't want to play anymore. It's not that they're sulking, they're just not interested anymore. So the controlling play can be something that does bust up friendships sometimes, because nobody really wants to be told what to do, right? And kids telling kids what to do or being the playground police, other kids don't really like it that much. Sometimes autistic children just lose interest in other kids, or maybe they were never interested in the first place. A lot of kids tell me, well, I'm not really interested in what they're doing. I'd rather do my own thing because it's more fun. So it's not that they don't want to be friends. It's just, they're not interested. They don't feel like they're missing out on anything. Now, the last thing we're looking at is repetitive behaviours. So this can come in many different forms. So it could come in body movements like flapping when you're excited. Doing this is always popular, flicking, this sort of thing, twisting, shaking your hands like that. All of those are repetitive behaviours. Other things that are repetitive are kind of more big body movements. So that might be spinning. Often for girls, I wouldn't phrase it as spinning, I would phrase it as twirling. So, grandma may have noticed that their granddaughter just loves dancing and she's always twirling about. That doesn't seem that odd. But when a boy is spinning, that seems to be a dead giveaway, but a girl twirling isn't. But it's still a repetitive behaviour. It's just kind of more socially acceptable, I guess. That's the way we've been socialised. Dancy little girls are fine. That's what we think. The other thing is bouncing, walking on tiptoes. Rocking is also popular. Another one that's quite popular is actually dive bombing onto the couch. That's always very popular, and that's also a sensory seeking behaviour. A child wanting that pressure. So they're going to dive bomb on the couch and they're going to bang into everybody when you walk through the door because they want the pressure, or that maybe they've got developmental coordination disorder where they're a little bit clumsy and they just bang into everything. Sometimes it's sensory seeking, but other times it's that coordination difficulty there. What we notice too is that a lot of autistic people love having a routine. They have very particular routines for their morning and often going to bed, and they very much like to stick to their routine. If their routine gets disrupted, they might become very upset and they may have to start all over again. So routine is very important, as is sameness. This is why sometimes autistic people eat the same food. They like it. Why wouldn't they eat it all the time? Or driving the same way to school or to work. They don't want it to change. They really like things to be predictable and the same because they feel safe when it's the same and they know what's going to happen next. Another one is highly fixated interests. I think that sounds a little bit judgy, like it's a bad thing. Doesn't have to be. Just a super interest or a super passion for a particular subject. It might be Lego, it might be Pokemon, it might be My Little Pony. But either way, they're very, very passionate about one thing. They love to talk about it, they love to read about it, they love to watch it on YouTube, and they love to collect it quite often as well. The last thing that we're looking for is sensory sensitivity. So once again, this is things like noise. A lot of kids are very noisy, but they don't want other people to be noisy. So they're quite happy as long as they're the one making the noise. They might be very sensory sensitive to their clothes, their food. Maybe they don't want it touching. They don't want it all mixed in like in a casserole or a stew. That's icky. They like their food to be separate. They might have very particular needs for their socks or their undies, and sometimes it can be really hard to get out the door because somebody's sock had a lump in it. A lot of autistic people don't like to wear underwear because they find it very uncomfortable, but you kind of have to sometimes. But that's another sensory challenge that autistic people face sometimes. So overall, there's the three big things. So if we're going for the meal deal, we're going communication, socialisation, and repetitive behaviours, and also a little side of sensory things and wanting sameness. Thanks for listening to this episode today of Thriving with Autism. I hope you found it useful. I've got in the show notes below a link to an info sheet that explains in a summary what the autistic diagnostic criteria is. If you'd like to know more, feel free to jump over and download that and check it out. And if you've got more questions, you can always ask me. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Welcome to a place where we rise, where we grow. Stories of courage the world needs to know. With Liz Smalley, we lift every voice. Educate, validate, advocate, celebrate, rejoice.